Okay, it's 2 minutes after 1. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Michigan Historic Preservation Network November webinar. My name is Xiaohan Bao Smith. I am your moderator today. We are going to hear a presentation about the introduction to the Certified Local Government Program. And before I turn it over to our speaker, I would like to go over some Zoom items. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box as you think of them. All the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please also type them into the Q&A box. The chat box will be used to share links or resources to discuss during the webinar, and both the Q&A and chat boxes are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you don't see them, please wiggle your mouse. And please participate in the survey after the webinar concludes. If this is your first time attending our webinar, we are the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. We support the sustainability and economic viability of Michigan's historic places through advocacy, education, and direct action. We could not do the work we do without our members and volunteers. So if you are not a member yet, please consider joining us at www.mhpn.org. And our webinar series is sponsored in part by an award from the Michigan Arts and Culture Council. It is my great pleasure today to introduce you our speaker, Haley Schreiber. She is a certified local government and community preservation coordinator of the Michigan State Historic Preservation Office. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Haley.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. And then we'll get started. Okay. Can you see the presentation now? Yes, okay. All right, well, great. Like Xiaohan said, my name is Haley Schreiber. I am the Certified Local Government and Community Preservation Coordinator here at the SHPO office. So I work with the CLG program as well as local historic districts. So if you have any questions about those things, feel free to reach out to me. I'm also kind of the point person for our office if you have any general preservation questions that I can then point you in the right direction to the correct staff person. But today I am here to introduce the State Historic Preservation Office, or the SHPO, as well as the Certified Local Government Program. So I'll be doing a brief overview of what the SHPO does, our program areas, and examples of technical services before diving into the CLG program itself. So we will review not only the requirements and benefits of the program, but how its framework can help you gain access to technical assistance, pursue exclusive grant funding, and build a development-friendly toolbox, ideally. So overall, the purpose of the CLG program is to provide framework to help communities establish long-term approaches to engaging historic preservation as part of their suite of options to make their community better. The Michigan State Historic Preservation Office, or the SHPO, is a division of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, or the MEDC. The MEDC is also the overseeing entity for the Michigan Main Street program, which some of you might be more familiar with. Our purpose here at the SHPO is to assist local communities in their preservation efforts. So this means aiding communities in identifying, evaluating, designating, protecting, and then telling the story of Michigan's historic resources. We also provide on-the-ground support to communities to help them determine their goals and priorities. This can come in the form of technical assistance or training and education. The SHPO program structure breaks down into 4 areas. The first being the archaeology program, and this is as straightforward as it sounds. It's our archaeologists, and if you ever find perhaps an arrowhead or a pottery sherd, or even in some cases human remains, if you find human remains, you should call the police first. But the second person you would then call would be our office, because there are important sites that we do need to monitor, and so our archaeologists need to be made aware of that. And generally, if you have any other questions about things you might be finding in your yard or garden or a work site, feel free to reach out to our office. The second area is cultural resource management and planning. Some of you might be more familiar with the term Section 106 within this area. So anytime federal monies are used for, it's called an undertaking, and that requires a review process through our office. So you want to go ahead and contact us as early as possible in that process. The third area is identification and designation. This means survey, National Register of Historic Places nominations, and local historic districts. The fourth area is incentives and development, and that includes the CLG program as well as our historic tax credits. Now for the Certified Local Government Program. So for a bit of a history lesson, the program is administered by the National Park Service in a partnership with the State Historic Preservation Office in each state. The CLG program is a national program that was developed in the 1980s to encourage and support local preservation activities. And it's really a way to leverage the skill set and assistance of the Park Service and the SHPO office to help you supplement and complement the efforts that are happening within your local community. So figuring out how to incorporate historic preservation into local planning activities. And so through this program, a formal partnership is established through the Park Service, SHPO, and participating local governments, which gives the local community access to tools not otherwise available. And at the end of the day, it's about leveraging partnerships for the benefit of the community. And now that you know how and when the program started, you might be wondering, what is a CLG? A CLG is a local unit of government, so that can mean county, township, city, or village that has made a formal commitment to historic preservation at the local level. Our CLGs have enrolled in the program so that they can formally engage in preservation planning. And our goal really is to meet the community at whatever level they are at. So we have communities that have a long and very formal history with preservation planning. You know, they have a dedicated staff person and robust kind of institutional knowledge around preservation. But then we also have communities that are just beginning to start their preservation journey and really understanding what resources they have. So our goal at the SHPO is to create a very, an experience that any of these communities can use. And we can then tweak the technical assistance or the funding and other resources that they might need for the type of community that they're in. So this is just an infographic showing kind of what I just said, that because communities across the state vary so widely in size, capacity, and resources, not all communities can hire a professional staff person or somebody with a background in preservation, that it's important that the CLG program recognizes that and provides tools and activities that look different across the state. It's important to recognize that the CLG program, while it is a national program that has certain requirements, it really places the priority at the local level. It's not about us telling a community what its goals should be. Rather, it starts with the local community telling us what their needs, priorities, and goals are, and then us figuring out how we can best help the community achieve those goals. So this is just an infographic reiterating that statement. So how it works is that the National Park Service, over to the left of your screen, they provide us with the CLG program standards. They also have the Secretary of the Interior standards, as well as other guidelines and best practices that we have to adhere to. And then they run the Historic Preservation Fund. That is then trickles down to the SHPO office, where we administer the annual CLG grant funding, we provide the technical assistance, and then the training and education. And then at the local unit of government, that's where your Historic District Commission and public outreach is happening. It's more involved in that day-to-day activity of goal setting and priority projects. And I wanted to include this map because I think it's fun to see what your neighbors are up to. You can see that we have a lot of representation in the southern half of the Lower Peninsula, but not so much in the Upper Peninsula. And that's something I personally like to see change more, or see some change in, and see more communities in that region getting access to these resources. Over to the left, we have all 42 of our communities. We have some dating back to 1985, and then most recently as this year. All right, so what are the requirements for joining the CLG program? So like the Main Street program or Redevelopment Ready program or any other community-focused tool that you might be familiar with, there are a series of baseline requirements for communities that wish to participate in the program. In this instance, these requirements are mandated by the National Park Service, which we noted earlier as the ultimate administrator for the program. For the CLG program, there are 5 requirements. So we'll go through each of these. The first is you must enact and enforce a historic district ordinance. Now, our office offers a model ordinance for applicants to use. It's essentially a plug and play document that our office created so that you would already be complying with state law when you plug in your information here, and just makes it a lot easier for applicants instead of having to start from scratch. The second is to establish a historic district commission. 3 is to maintain a system for the survey of historic resources. And by this, we mean that there has to be a plan for a systematic survey. This can vary depending on the capacity of your community. But really what we want to see is rather see slow and steady progress and effort to survey rather than trying to bite off something larger than you can chew. So we'd rather see a community commit to surveying, let's say, 5 properties a year instead of trying to do a whole district in one. So it's just setting yourself up for success instead of being disappointed a year later. Number 4 is to provide for public participation in the local program. This is meeting the Open Meetings Act and allows for community participation and preservation and priorities and goal setting. So you want your community to really buy into these initiatives and have their support. Number 5 is to satisfactorily perform responsibilities. This means submitting an annual report where a community reports on how many Historic District Commission meetings have occurred or any updates to the local ordinance. You should also include your goals for survey, education, and outreach. Now, beyond these 5 requirements, it is ultimately up to the individual community with how much they want to use the program. All right, so you've heard the requirements. So now you're probably interested in hearing more about what are the benefits of being in the program. So I like to use this sort of cheat sheet to provide an overview of some of the program benefits and what we offer to a community that participates in the CLG program versus a community that does not participate in the program. And over the last maybe 5 years or so, our program, we've really tried to take a hard look at our program and try and refresh these benefits to incorporate a more proactive, hands-on approach that builds the capacity of our local partners. I'm not going to go into each one of these benefits. I've highlighted a few throughout the next couple of slides that we can talk through more. But one of the biggest ones that I think really pulls people in is that our exclusive grant funding to CLG communities. That is not accessible if you're not in the CLG. We also provide monthly newsletters, which include other workshops that maybe aren't through the SHPO, but other organizations provide a resource library, which includes very handy program bulletins that we want you to use, but you can also hand out to the general public. And that's just to name a few of those benefits. All right, so as part of the CLG program, we offer specialized SHPO support and technical assistance. Some examples of this are that as the CLG coordinator, I act as the liaison for your community with the office staff. So for example, if you're interested in survey planning, a CLG may request to meet with the SHPO's survey coordinator to review best practices and strategize potential approaches for survey. Other communities may need help identifying what to do with an underutilized or problem building. So a CLG may request an on-site meeting with one of our historical architects to assess the building and discuss potential uses in the future. And then a final example would be CLGs have the ability to request visits from the SHPO archaeologists if they have concerns regarding threats or wish to locally designate a site. Benefits continued, so training and education. As part of the program, CLGs have special access to educational and training materials, which I had briefly mentioned earlier. We also aim to provide a variety of training and outreach opportunities for those communities. Some examples of this include access to the CLG resource library, which includes bulletins, manuals, and other published materials for a range of topics. We have things specific for historic district commissions, resources published by the National Alliance for Preservation Commissions are particularly useful. And then our office provides webinars and specialized newsletters to the CLG communities. Oh, and one last thing on this is, depending on the year and available funding, the program has been known to provide additional financial resources for training. So for instance, this year, we have an opportunity for CLGs to apply for training and educational funding, which can be used to send a staff person or an HDC member to attend a conference or to host a training workshop for your entire HDC. So you could use something like MHPN puts on workshops as well as NAPC. So that's something we're pretty excited about this year to be able to offer to our communities. All right, the CLG subgrant program. Now, this is admittedly one of the biggest draws to the program, is that grant funding. So I think it's important that we talk about where this grant funding comes from. So every year, the National Park Service provides us, the SHPO, with an operating grant through the Historic Preservation Fund. The SHPO then sets aside 10% of its federal allocation directly to the CLG grant program. We at the SHPO then administer an annual competitive subgrant program in which applicants may receive reimbursable grant monies for approved projects. Our office typically selects 3 to 7 projects annually, and right now there is no match requirement. And funds can fall into one of 2 categories. The first is preservation planning, documentation, and education, and the second is rehabilitation planning or rehabilitation projects. Okay, so this is a deeper dive into those 2 categories. Projects can focus on preservation planning, documentation, and education projects, or rehabilitation and rehabilitation planning projects. This first category that you see really focuses on the foundational preservation tools. They're not always, at first glance, maybe not the most exciting, but they're definitely some of the most important for a community, no matter if you're first starting out in preservation or if your community's been doing preservation for a long time. So some examples of this would be updating historic context studies, updating your survey, design guidelines, local ordinances, all of the framework that makes your planning and preservation work together and really sets the foundation again for those later activities that might be more bricks and mortar or development. So I really like to emphasize that even if you're just starting or you're already in the process, you should always consider some of these foundational practices first when you're applying for a grant. The second category is rehabilitation and rehabilitation planning projects. So rehabilitation planning projects are pre-development activities that help promote continued use and investment in historic properties. Eligible project activities include things like plans and specifications, historic structure reports, cultural landscape studies, feasibility studies, etc. And then rehabilitation projects are development activities and more of that physical bricks and mortar work. And these help to stabilize, rehabilitate, preserve, or restore a property. Eligible project activities could include structural repairs and stabilization, roof repair and replacement, masonry and siding repair, etc. Now, it's just as important to note which projects we can't fund. So a CLG grant cannot be used for physical work on private property, fundraising, historical marker, or plaques. You cannot use a CLG grant to fund work that is started or completed prior to the execution of the CLG grant agreement. And this is something that if you are interested in applying for a grant, definitely come speak to us first and we'll go over all of this again. You don't have to have this all memorized. Right, just take a sip of water. So now I wanted to look at a few examples of what grants have funded in the past. Our first one is more of a bricks and mortar project, and this is for Charlevoix. So in 2022, Charlevoix applied for the fiscal year 2023 grant cycle to replace the roof of its train depot. Now, the CLG grant did not cover the entire expense of this project, but it was really helpful in, gathering all that grant money that they needed to complete the job. So this wrapped up this summer. A second example is more in line with sort of that foundational preservation that I was talking about earlier. So we're looking at Washtenaw County, and they have been previous grant awardees, and they have used the grant to fund documentation and survey projects. They've previously been awarded 4 grants in which they've completed a thematic study that they then use to create educational materials and heritage tourism materials. And this really speaks to their capacity to incrementally survey and inventory their historic resources, which has then facilitated the educational opportunities for both tourists and locals. And projects like these really spark renewed interest in a community, which supports the local economy and that community pride. A third example is similar to Washtenaw, and that is with the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit has used a couple of their grants to fund their Detroit Modernism Tour. So these have been used for documentation and survey projects along their corridors, and some of the CLG grant funded deliverables have been photographs of the resources and scripts for 2 walking tours, 1 bike tour, 1 car tour, and GIS mapping. Oh, and if you're curious about other projects that have happened through the CLG grant process, I really recommend you take a look at the previously awarded CLG grant page. It includes information from 2003 to the present, gives you some brief descriptions of all those projects, and it's great to look at if you're trying to find some inspiration or even ideas for the future. Okay, so let's say you're now interested in applying for the CLG program. Your first step is going to be enacting that historic district ordinance. And as I mentioned before, we have that model ordinance document, which I can send you. It's also available on our website. And it's basically a plug and play document. You put in your own local government's information, you send it back to me, I review it, make sure it complies with state law and nothing's been changed. And that is step one complete. Step two would be establishing a historic district commission. Once that is done, you can then begin the paper application process. I say paper, but you can also do it electronically. But filling out the application, you would then send that to me at the SHPO office for certification. At that time, I'll review it, make sure there's nothing that needs to be either tweaked or corrected. Send it back to you if we need revisions. And then once I received the final copy, I submit it to the National Park Service for concurrence. Now, you can apply any time of year to be in the program. We review them on a year-round basis, and we typically estimate 3 to 4 months for the entire process. And this can vary depending on how quickly I get documents back or how fast it takes to get that local ordinance in place. But typically it averages 3 to 4 months. Okay, so going back to where we started today, the CLG program is about preservation with a purpose. It's not preservation for preservation's sake. Rather, we want to emphasize that it's long-term approaches to engaging historic preservation as part of your suite of options that helps make your community better. The key to this idea is proactively planning for and leveraging historic places as valuable community goods for the future. So we want to make sure you're taking proactive approaches to making a community preservation ready. So examples of this would be queuing up places that are ready for reinvestment and revitalization through things like designating properties in the National Register of Historic Places, which then makes them eligible for federal historic preservation tax credits, or designate them as part of the local historic district, which also makes them eligible for state historic preservation tax credits. So it's about working systematically to get in front of potential future issues, to figure out those places of importance in your community, those essential pieces of your community infrastructure, and promoting a viable future for them that benefits residents, businesses, owners, and visitors. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to mention before we get into the Q&A session is that in October of this year, Alan Higgins, who is our grants manager and the former CLG coordinator, we recorded a webinar on the fiscal year 25 grant program. So even if you're not sure if your community can become certified for this year's cycle, this webinar is really a great opportunity to dive into the grant basics and eligibility requirements. It also goes over the types of projects this grant can fund and how to fill out the application. So I really recommend, if you're curious more about what the grant does, take a look at this webinar. I think we're gonna drop a link to it in the Q&A. Otherwise, email me and I can send it to you. And then the last little bit of the presentation that we recorded also discusses more of that training and education opportunity. So we do have some extra funding this year for CLG communities to apply for either conference attendance or to bring in a workshop into their neighborhood. So again, it's just a really great opportunity to take advantage of. All All right, so thank you all so much for attending. I know that that was a lot of information distilled into about 30 minutes. But if you're interested in seeing more, if the program is a right fit for your community, please reach out to me. We can have a phone call or Zoom and just kind of get to know more about the priorities or goals that you have for your community. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Haley. And just quickly mention to everybody the link to that webinar is in the chat box. So you can save that link or click it to watch the webinar. And we will now enter our Q&A session. And we do have a few questions already. We'll start with the first one here. Okay. When the National Historic Preservation Act was amended in 1980 to start the CLG program, the program got off to a really slow start. Do you know when this started to become a dynamic program it now is?
Have that institutional knowledge, but based on, we can take a look at the map even to see when we had kind of that uptick. Because I know we have some communities that enrolled in 1984, 1985. But based on the dates here, I would say maybe the 90s, early 2000s. That would be my best guess, but that's a great question.
Looks like somebody just had a question in the chat box. So why do you think there are few CLGs in the middle and upper part of the mitten?
Yeah, so I was actually just talking about this with one of my colleagues here, and I think a big part of it is capacity. A lot of them do not have a dedicated staff person through their municipal government to take this on. A lot of these communities, it's typically a clerk or even a secretary or administrative assistant that's taking on that work. And then to form your HDC, there are requirements about people's experience with historic preservation or history, archaeology, and sometimes it's just really hard to find people that have that experience to support that workload.
Thank you. Next question. We are very fortunate to have you assigned to the CLG program and Alan before you. Is it typical that a state will have a designated staff person for a CLG?
It really varies. I think we are one of the few that has only 1 or 2 jobs. A lot of other states, they do like 4 jobs. So we are very fortunate that, or I'm very fortunate that I have to focus on this and then local historic districts. That being said, there are states that have different setups and there are regions within their state, whereas I cover the whole state. So there's some trade-offs. But...
Okay, next question. A lot of Michigan survey work dates from the state's 150th anniversary, and it's old and missing important buildings of the recent past, like the mid-century modern. Can the CLG program fund resurvey?
Absolutely, yes. That is a great way to use a CLG grant, is to update your existing survey data.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Do CLG communities get together like the Main Street communities do?
Oh, that's a great idea. We don't currently, but I love that. We could definitely figure out maybe some regional or maybe even an annual Zoom or something, but I like that idea.
Next question. So if SHPO annual awards 3 to 7 CLG subgrants, how many applications do you commonly receive?
From what I've heard, it varies. I want to say the year before we got less than 15. So it's less than you think, is what I've heard.
Okay, next question. With 81 communities already having their local historic district ordinances, and with 42 communities recognized as CLGs. There are over 40 more communities that can maybe qualify for CLG status. And how many of them are in line for approval?
There are some that just are not interested in having any sort of maybe state say in their local government, which isn't complete. That's part of a larger argument of like not quite understanding how the program works. But we actually have maybe a handful kind of queued up that already have local historic districts that are now interested in becoming CLG because it is a free program. It gives you access to financial incentives and then technical assistance. But there's a lot of work to be done since there's 40 more.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Is this program generally accessible for communities with an established HDC but has lost capacity over the years and needs to build back staff capacity and accessible data?
Yeah, we definitely want to make sure this is accessible to everyone and isn't geared towards communities that have, large, robust staff or financial resources. So we do work with communities to try and make their HDC work, even if they don't have those professional qualifications. We have a range of communities that some are on the far end of the spectrum and others are on the opposite end. So we want to make it accessible to everyone.
Okay, next question. Does the SHPO provide technical services from their own staff or do they direct communities to consultants?
So we cannot endorse a specific consultant. So we handle everything in-house or to another state or nonprofit agency. So if I get a question, I will typically reach out within my office and see if it can be solved. But sometimes it's just something that's not within our wheelhouse. So I do work within the greater MEDC group to work with Michigan Main Street program or the redevelopment ready programs as well. And if it's something we can't do, we often pair with MHPM as well.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How does the SHPO articulate the economic benefits of becoming a CLG?
Well, I think that's definitely something we can keep improving on. We have a couple documents, I think, in our resource library that show the impact of CLG grant money. I think it's in up until the year 2020, so that does need to be updated. And then we have a couple other resources that talk about the benefits of designation and CLG status as well. So I can dig up some of those resources and we can disperse them.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Have any CLGs removed themselves from the program?
Yes, we have had some historically step away. There is no obligation to stay in if you feel that you've gotten what you need out of it. We have had communities that as staff people change over, they don't really, it's just not driving with what they want to do, or they don't understand the program, that they let it go. So that happens. You can always rejoin.
Okay, next question. How much funding is available on a yearly basis and how is it distributed among grant requests?
Okay. So it's 10% of our allocation, so it varies year to year. But for this upcoming cycle, it's $240,000 that will then be divided up amongst the grantees. We have a grant manual, which we can also send a link to, but the grant manual includes the requirements and then scoring criteria for anyone who applies. So we're very transparent about which kind of projects are going to get you a higher score. So if you're aligning with some of the SHPO's goals, we are trying to focus more on underrepresented communities or maybe a community that hasn't applied for a grant in a while. like in the last 5 years. So we do provide that criteria so you can have a better sense of where you are with the competition.
Okay, and I think we have gone through all the questions. Oh, and somebody said an annual CLG meeting would be wonderful.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay, looks like, okay, so Haley will be speaking at MHPN's 45th conference in May 15th through 17th, 2025. And the conference will be in Sault Ste. Marie. I just going to send a link to the chat so you can check our website for more information. Registration will open sometime mid-February, so please follow this news. And before I let everybody go, I want to say a big thank you to Haley for your knowledge and time sharing this with us. And our next webinar is scheduled for December. I will share my screen real quick. It's for December 12th at 1 p.m. It's the Castle Museum Archaeology. And hope to see you all next time. And a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available in the next few days. You will receive an email when the recording is available. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach to us. And if you have a specific webinar topic that you want to hear about, please also let us know. Or if you're interested in speaking at our webinar, please also reach out to us. And thank you everybody for participating today. And thank you again, Haley, for your time, and see you all next time.